When the attack happened, I was preparing my harvest for sale. Then we had gunshots. Everyone started running. Now my entire village is gone. Everything is ashes. The conflict feels endless. These are the words of Rosalina Maciel, a native of Mozambique's Cabo Delgado province, describing the impact of jihadist violence on the region. Rosalina's story is not unique. It echoes throughout Cabo Delgado, where, according to Médecins Sans Frontières, 50,000 were uprooted from their home this year by an upsurge in violence. Unfortunately, this surge is just the latest in a conflict that has, since 2017, killed more than 6,000 people and forced over hundreds of thousands from homes. What began as sporadic attacks on police posts and villages has evolved into a protracted insurgency. Complicating matters is a government-imposed media blackout that limits how much information the international community has access to. As such, the insurgency is now one of the world's least covered humanitarian crises. And the violence shows no signs of stopping. So how did Mozambique get here? How did Cabo Delgado, home to one of the world's largest natural gas fields, go from a province full of promise to a battleground? And is there any way to stop it? Okay, before we can answer the first of our big questions today, you need to know a few facts about Mozambique. First, it is a majority Christian nation except for two northern provinces, Cabo Delgado and Niassa. Second, ethnicity plays a major role in every facet of life here, from politics to economics, even conflict. Third, and perhaps most importantly, one party, Frelimo, has ruled Mozambique since it gained independence from Portugal in 1975, and you better believe locals' fortunes rely upon keeping the mono-party happy. With this in mind, let's now look at the events of the 5th of October 2017, the day that can reasonably be called the start of the war. That was the day that 30 armed men descended on Morier-Genoud, a port town in Cabo Delgado, holding it hostage for 48 hours. They attacked the police station, stealing firearms and ammunition, and killing several people in what the police described as an indiscriminate attack aimed at sowing fear and creating public disorder. It was the first attack from a group that, at the time, still had no official name. Some called them Al-Shabaab, others Al-Sinar wal-Jamaa, while reporters at the independent news organization MediaFax christened them Swahili Suna. The name Al-Shabaab stuck because, despite having no official ties to the Somali group with the same name, they shared the same tactics. While we use Al-Shabaab in this piece because, number one, it's easier to pronounce. Yes. And number two, it's the name most people are already familiar with. But just to save ourselves from having to repeat it every time, let's reiterate that this Al-Shabaab is not the same as the more famous Somali terror group of the same name. It's kind of like how David Mitchell, the author, is a distinct entity from David Mitchell, the famed comedian, only with more kidnapping. And as far as we know, neither of the Mitchells have been up to any of that. While there was some initial confusion about what to call the attackers, the identity of those involved wasn't in contention. Dr. Eric Morier-Genoud, professor of African history at Queen's University Belfast, claimed the majority of the attackers had grown up locally in Mozambique, while some came from other districts in Cabo Delgado and a few had foreign accents. Almost all of them were living in the town before the attack. The residents who identified the insurgents also cast doubt upon the idea that the attacks were indiscriminate. One resident told the press, "They had a machete, a knife, and a machine gun, and one told me not to be afraid because they were only after the police." Now, whatever its origins, the attack left the authorities scrambling. By the 10th of October, the police had arrested 52 people, which only seemed to spur the insurgents to respond with even more violence. Again, the police responded with arrests, this time increasing the number to 100 and closing 3 mosques believed to have links to the attackers. Luckily, being violent Islamist rebels, they responded peacefully and with moderation. No. They brutally murdered 2 villagers, one by a beheading and the other by burning them alive. Moderation. Violence on such a scale was meant to serve 3 purposes. 1, send a message to the government that Al-Shabaab was not a group to be taken lightly. Closing the mosques and arresting several hundred people would not be enough to stop them. 2, it served to scare ordinary residents from cooperating with the police. The mafia has a murder, the insurgents have fear. And finally, number 3, it served as a recruiting tool to bring in new fighters who saw the brutality as a form of strength and defiance against a state that had marginalized its Islamic minority for years. What followed was the beginning of a full-blown insurgency. As its numbers swelled, Al-Shabaab ramped up its attacks, targeting both civilians and state officials. Their highest-profile target was a national police director, who they killed on the 17th of December. With every victory, every gun stolen from the police, Al-Shabaab increased not just their appetite for violence, but their ability to inflict it. They quickly evolved from a ragtag group into a terror organization that would still be fighting the state more than 8 years after their first attack. As the fighting escalated, analysts began asking the deeper questions. Why Cabo Delgado, and why now? Some experts, including Mozambican Islamic cleric Sheikh Said Habibe, believe that radical Islam is a key factor behind the insurgency. They posit that young Muslims, often discriminated against by the country's Christian majority, have been radicalized by extremist preachers from Kenya and Tanzania. These experts also pointed more broadly to Mozambican students who had studied at Saudi Arabian, Egyptian, and Sudanese universities as sources of radicalization. These students often struggled to find jobs upon returning to Mozambique and were more critical of the local Sufi traditions. Joseph Hanlon, a senior lecturer at the Open University, offers a bit of a different take. He believes that poverty is the primary driver of the conflict. Mozambique is one of the poorest countries in the world, with over half of its population living on less than $1 a day. Cabo Delgado is one of the poorest provinces, which is really saying something here. Part of the reason why Cabo Delgado is so poor is that after gaining independence, successive governments in Maputo focused on developing the country's south, leaving the north starved of opportunities. Local communities such as the Mawani were often excluded from power, overshadowed by southern elites and the politically favored Makonde community. When natural gas was discovered in the province in 2010, the residents expected their fortunes to change. However, by 2017, it was clear that those promises wouldn't reach Cabo Delgado's minority communities. Instead, many locals felt the riches were being siphoned off by the Makonde, the elites in Maputo, and foreign corporations. Regardless of the attackers' motives, though, the government seemed incapable of stopping them. Quoting Professor Alicia Macamo, a Mozambican sociologist here, the attacks expose the fragility of the Mozambican state, and the authorities have no idea what is happening in that locality. End quote. The government tried an amnesty program, promising rebels jobs and a way out of poverty if they laid down their arms. When this failed, they announced counterinsurgency operations in the forest surrounding Mutambate, which had become a stronghold for the insurgents. Maputo also declared the group's actions terrorism, but that did as much to stop them as those online disclaimers that say by clicking here, "You're really over 18, I definitely promise." So, things began to spiral. Al-Shabaab launched a campaign of violence, but while the attacks by this point were to be expected, what happened next certainly wasn't. In late January 2018, a video spread on social media showing 6 individuals dressed in civilian clothes camped in a forest. They covered their faces, brandished rifles, and speaking in both Portuguese and Arabic, called on Mozambicans to join them in fighting the devil and defending the values of Islam they claimed to have corrupted. The language choice was very specific. Portuguese for the average Mozambican, and Arabic as a nod to something larger, a claim to legitimacy within the wider universe of Islamist militancy. This video transformed the group's image from that of local bandits, extremely violent, but local bandits nonetheless, into an ideological project wrapped in the imagery and language of global jihad. And it was a sign of worse things to come. By April 2018, reports were coming in that ISIS fighters had infiltrated the country to support the insurgents. While the government tried to pretend that they had the situation fully under control, anyone who wasn't working in the state propaganda department could see the reality of things. The most feared terror group on Earth was now operating on Mozambique's soil, and there was no way in hell that this could lead to anything except the chaos. Now, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, or ACLED, has reported that the association with ISIS gave the Cabo Delgado insurgents access to both technical assistance and external financial support. This was supported by the UN, which reported that the Islamic State had tasked IS Somalia, based in Puntland, with coordinating support across the region through its Kara hub. And yes, I know that the involvement of a Somali terror group in an episode about a different Al-Shabaab just makes things even more confusing, but just to be clear, we're still not talking about the better-known one. This is still very much a less famous David Mitchell situation. The partnership with IS Somalia sharpened the group's core focus to challenge the state by refocusing on local grievances and targeting the natural gas project. That support paid dividends in May 2019 when insurgents overran the Mozambican army in Mocimboa da Praia district. ISIS took credit for the attack, claiming that it was carried out by the Islamic State of Central African Province, or ISCAP, a region that included Mozambique and the DRC, which was and still is dealing with its own Islamic insurgency, one that we recently covered in another video, by the way. Check it out after this one if you want to. By 2020, the insurgency was shifting in character, though. Fighters aligned themselves more openly with the Islamic State. They raised its black flag over captured territory. But perhaps the most telling development was how they changed tactics on the ground. Instead of indiscriminate brutality, they sought to win over local communities by handing out looted supplies and presenting themselves as an alternative to a government that many of them already distrusted. The fact that the group had stopped attacking civilians wasn't a sign that they'd turned over a new leaf. It was a strategy. They dangled the carrot of redistributing wealth to a poverty-stricken populace while still hiding a stick behind their back, as the people of Ixtaxi soon found out. On the 7th of April, Al-Shabaab attacked its Taxi village, where they first used the carrot to try to recruit the village's young men to join the group. When this failed, they gathered all the young men and executed them in what witnesses described as a brutal massacre. Local journalists reported that many of the victims were beheaded, and the bodies were left to serve as a warning to the entire region. The surviving villagers fled to refugee camps that were ill-equipped to take care of them. South African outlet Mail and Guardian reported that while the provincial government was concerned with the people's plight, the national government seemed tired of helping. Armindo Nagunga, head of a government body created to speed up development in the country's north, told the press, quote, "People cannot spend the rest of their lives receiving food support and complaining that it is insufficient." It is this callous attitude from Maputo that the insurgents had successfully capitalized on when wielding the carrot. All of these attacks by the insurgents contributed to the US government's decision to list Al-Shabaab as an ISIS affiliate. Paradoxically, Professor Chris Alden believes that this placement on Washington's terrorism watch list may have inadvertently raised the group's international profile and even facilitated recruitment. Whoops-a-daisy. The conflict played out much the same way through the rest of 2020 and 2021, with the insurgents attacking any location they considered vulnerable and the government playing catch-up. ACLED data shows that by the end of 2020, the government was losing control of the north, with insurgents controlling key roads that connect the provincial capital, Pemba, to Cabo Delgado's northern districts. In March 2021, Al-Shabaab would use its control of these roads to launch a major attack on Palma. Now, if you're wondering where the heck Palma is, well, don't worry about that. For most of its history, no one else knew either. But then, vast reserves of natural gas were discovered in Cabo Delgado, and the town was transformed into a hub for the industry. Growth was driven by a $60 billion project operated by the French energy giant Total Energies on the nearby Afungi Peninsula. But while this led to massive development, it also made it the perfect target for Al-Shabaab, who, after their partnership with ISIS, had made targeting the natural gas projects a key tenet of their ideology. A fact that security experts and regional observers, including ACLED analyst Jasmine Opperman, had warned about in the lead-up to the attack. Opperman would later write on X, "Why in God's name was no action taken in response to early warning intelligence? It's a disgrace." The attack on Palma began on the 7th of March 2021, when Al-Shabaab captured the border post at Nonje, effectively isolating the town from the rest of the nation. From this position, the insurgents, disguised as civilian soldiers and policemen, infiltrated Palma, hiding weapons to be used in the assault. On the 24th, more than 100 fighters launched a coordinated three-pronged assault. They initially targeted police stations and checkpoints, then used explosives to break into 2 banks. They also targeted residential neighborhoods and the gas project, killing both locals and foreign workers. When the dust settled, over 1,100 civilians had died. What surprised most observers was how little resistance the militants faced. Most of the security forces present in the town had fled, and those who remained behind to stage a defense were quickly overrun. A nearby army unit refused to help Palma, not wanting to weaken its own fortified position on the Afungi Peninsula. The government would eventually send in troops to recapture the city on the 28th of March. Demonstrating what Tim Lister, an analyst for West Point's Combating Terror Center, described as tactical awareness, the militants quickly withdrew to avoid being trapped by the military. For Al-Shabaab, the attack was a major success. They were able to take control of the town relatively easily, hold it for 4 days, and escape without suffering any major casualties. They also managed to get away with 23 tons of food and around $1 million in cash, according to some estimates. Most importantly, it demonstrated the group's growing military capabilities. Alexandra Raymakers, an analyst at the global risk intelligence company Verisk Maplecroft, told CNN, quote, "The group's ability to hit multiple targets simultaneously in a three-pronged approach and the use of small arms fire combined with mortar fire to overwhelm government forces in just a couple of hours shows enhanced command and control and discipline." The government, on the other hand, well, they tried to act like the kid in the playground who just lost a fight, but didn't want anybody to say that they lost the fight. They limited the local media's ability to cover the events and tried to push their own narrative of success. The international media, though, didn't really care about what Maputo wanted, with the New York Times publishing a story titled "Militants Attacked a Key Town in Mozambique. Where was the government?" The impacts on the government extended beyond international embarrassment. Total Energies pulled out of the project because Maputo had failed to keep a key security guarantee. Soon after this attack, Islamic State leadership declared that Al-Shabaab, now referred to as Islamic State Mozambique or ISM, would operate autonomously from ISCAP. Think of it as a reward for bloodshed, sort of like your boss promoting you to line manager for consistent good work. Sadly, that promotion meant one thing and one thing only for Mozambique civilians. Things were about to get a whole lot worse. Alright, so with all this going on, you're probably asking, well, Simon, where the was the international community, my dude? Well, that's an important question, especially when you consider the risk of the conflict spilling over into neighboring countries. So, where the were they? Well, according to Professor Alden, the international community did not intervene because of two reasons. One, regional apathy. For months, key regional players like South Africa and Zimbabwe hesitated as they focused on their own domestic political and economic crises. Even Tanzania was slow to act, only deploying forces to its border after insurgents attacked the border town of Kitaya, killing Tanzanian citizens. The second reason was Maputo. President Filipe Nyusi, Mozambique's leader at the time, was reluctant to bring in any international help, whether from regional partners in the Southern African Development Community, or SADC, or other nations like France or the United States. Maputo feared that such an intervention would expose how much the government was struggling to deal with the insurgents, undermining Frelimo's leadership. The government instead chose to partner with a litany of mercenary companies such as Russia's Wagner Group and South Africa's Dirk Advisory Group, or DAG, partnerships which were, let's just say, unsuccessful. Wagner left Mozambique in March of 2020 after a series of stinging defeats at the hands of the insurgents. According to Daily Maverick, these defeats happened because the soldiers rushed into battle without proper intelligence, training, preparation, or knowledge of the terrain. Additionally, they struggled to coordinate with the Mozambican army because they didn't speak the same language, which could make coordination challenging. They were replaced with the DAG, who, despite being more successful, were a lot more controversial. Yes, they were more controversial than the goddamn Wagner Group, aka the guys famous for sledgehammering their own comrades to death for desertion. Amnesty International reports that DAG operatives repeatedly targeted civilian infrastructure like hospitals, schools, and homes. Amnesty also accused the DAG of racism, specifically prioritizing evacuating white victims over black victims during the Battle of Palma. Ironically, it would be the Battle of Palma that finally led to greater international intervention in the conflict. Spurred on by the attack, the SADC moved forward with planning a regional military intervention. The SADC force that deployed to Mozambique on the 15th of July 2021 would wind up staying in the country for about 3 years, leaving primarily because of chronic underfunding and regional priorities shifting to DRC's fight with M23. In that time, the African Centre for the Construction Resolution of Disputes, or ACORD, credited the deployments with dislodging the insurgents from their bases, seizing weapons, facilitating the flow of humanitarian aid, and the return of internally displaced persons to their homes. However, these gains were short-lived. According to DefenseWeb, a South African-based outlet focusing on security, SADC's withdrawal in mid-2024 left a security vacuum, and the insurgents took full advantage, increasing the frequency of attacks. Alongside the SADC forces, Mozambique also signed a bilateral agreement with Rwanda, allowing the smaller nation to deploy 1,000 personnel from its defense forces and police to Cabo Delgado. In the following years, the number of Rwandan troops in Mozambique rose from 1,000 to around 5,000. The Mozambican government justified this increase by pointing to the improved security situation in the region. While the Rwandan troops have undoubtedly been successful on the battlefield, the lack of security reforms in Cabo Delgado has been a point of concern for regional observers. Colton Caldedo, a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Joaquim Chissano University, points to fears that Rwandan forces could become lax in their operations, worsening the security situation and ultimately making the Rwandan troops more necessary for the safety of locals and businesses. These fears appear to be materializing. According to ACLED, in March 2025, a senior figure in Mozambique's local force, a government-backed militia fighting the ISM, accused Rwandan forces of being unwilling to engage the ISM in combat. He claims that the Rwandan forces often turned up hours after an attack, even when they were located nearby. Such a dynamic risks creating a vicious cycle. The longer Mozambique relies on external troops without addressing its own military weaknesses and governance failures, the harder it will be to rebuild trust in the state. Especially as it becomes clear that the international community's involvement, while essential, has not been a silver bullet. According to Austin Doctor, a professor of political science at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, ISM changed tactics after Palmer and the introduction of international players. No longer able to hold towns, the group fractured into smaller, more mobile cells that pushed further inland. Their attacks became sporadic, less about seizing territory, and more about spreading fear. And spread fear they did. By the summer of 2025, the conflict in Cabo Delgado was estimated to have killed 6,100 people and displaced more than 700,000, according to Global Protection Cluster, a network of humanitarian organizations led by the UNHCR. The sporadic random nature of the attacks has also made the region near ungovernable. From a province dedicated to the extraction of natural gas, Cabo Delgado has sunk into a state of lawlessness with kidnappings, murders, and assault all on the rise. These are the attacks that the region witnessed in July and August this year, forcing people like Rosalina Maciel to flee their homes. Do you remember Rosalina? She was the local woman we met in our introduction, the one who saw her entire village burned down by militants. And the worst part, no one seems to have any clue how to stop things like this from happening again. So, if international intervention hasn't been a silver bullet, and Maputo has proven incapable of defeating ISM on its own, then we have to ask, well, what will it take to bring peace to Cabo Delgado? One option favored by the current president, Daniel Chapo, is dialogue. The idea is not entirely new. Former President Joaquim Chissano first suggested it in 2021, but having a sitting president openly endorse it lends it a lot more weight. However, Professor Morier-Genoud questions how successful dialogue will be when the insurgents' ultimate goal is the total rejection of Mozambique's secular state and the creation of an Islamic order. Since they view this as a matter of faith rather than political bargaining, hardline leaders may reject any negotiations outright. So if dialogue's out of the question, what other options exist? Well, according to the Institute for Security Studies, or ISS, Maputo's best bet at resolving this conflict is creating a strategy that tackles the security, humanitarian, political, economic, social, and religious aspects of the insurgency, which is definitely easier said than done. The truth is, no one really knows what will bring lasting peace to Cabo Delgado. Experts can propose strategies, regional forces can deploy troops, and politicians can promise dialogue, but unfortunately, what's been tried just hasn't worked so far, and the government doesn't seem receptive to new ideas. What's even more unfortunate is that Cabo Delgado can seem like small potatoes when compared to the carnage unfolding in Ukraine, Sudan, or Gaza. The death toll's lower, the geopolitical stakes are smaller, and international coverage is fleeting. However, for people like Rosalina, the scale of the conflict is irrelevant. Everything she owned was burnt to ashes. She has no home to return to. It's proof that even a conflict that has killed comparatively fewer people still leaves behind devastation that will take decades to heal. It still ruins lives, even as it plays out far from the headlines. Sebastian Traficante, the head of Médecins Sans Frontières in Mozambique, likely said it best. The crisis cannot remain invisible. Whether the world chooses to pay attention or not, only time will tell, and if nothing changes, then people like Rosalina, they're destined to remain trapped in a cycle of displacement, poverty, and fear. And that is no way to live. Thank you for watching.